folks, this is Julia. This is a recap of our discussion in the first week of Theoretical Perspectives in Social Work, Part 1. So we talked about a variety of different influences on human behavior and social interactions, and we said that all of these influences can be sort of mapped or understood in Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory of development. And this is also called systems theory. So all of the influences on human development, human behavior, can be sort of put into this map. At the center we have influences from within the individual. Now, this includes biological influences, genetics, things like temperament, psychology, personality, values, beliefs, all the things that belong to individuals. And then outside of that realm we have the microsystem. And a microsystem is any group of two or more people that have face-to-face interaction. So key microsystems are families, schools, churches, peers, health services, workplace, and so on. The mesosystem is outside of the microsystem, and this includes interactions between systems, and specifically between systems that, at least one of those systems, does not include the individual herself. So for example, if the individual is a child, the interaction between a parent and the parent's workplace doesn't involve the child directly, but it has indirect influences on development. Outside of that ring, we have an exosystem. These are larger social systems, neighborhoods, social services, mass media, local politics, and industry. And then finally, at the outer ring, we have the macrosystem, attitudes and ideologies of the culture. And you can even think of another ring outside of that as being the sort of global environment in which we all live. Now, in each of these, at each of these systems levels, you can think about the influences on human behavior and human development as being risk or protective factors. Okay, a risk factor increases the likelihood of developing some kind of negative outcome, while a protective factor helps protect or buffer the risks of risk factors, and a protective factor increases the likelihood of a positive outcome. So this chart shows you some of the risk and protective factors associated in this case with adolescent problem behaviors. Now I should say, before looking at this chart more carefully, you have to know that risk and protective factors are identified with specific outcomes. So this chart shows that the risk factors associated with substance abuse are somewhat different from the risk factors associated with delinquency or dropout or violence. So it doesn't make sense to talk about risk and protective factors generally. We have to be talking about in relation to a specific outcome. That's why when you hear the term at-risk youth, that is not a meaningful term. We have at risk of what is the question. So here you see some risk factors at the community, family, school, and individual level for different problem behaviors in adolescence. There's an entire book on risk and protective factors in child development by Mark Fraser, and it goes into much more detail about these risk factors and problem behaviors. Here are some protective factors that are associated with some of the outcomes that we care about, just to give you a sense of what these are. Now, one of the things to understand is that the relationship between risk and protective factors and outcomes is not linear. It's not a one-to-one relationship. It's not that if you have a particular risk factor in your life, you're going to develop a certain outcome. That's not it at all. In fact, the relationship between risk factors and outcomes looks something like this. Now let me explain this graph to you. This is looking at the outcome of child maltreatment. So on the y-axis, the vertical axis, we have the percent of children who are suffering maltreatment. And on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we have the number of risk factors present. Now this is not specific risk factors, it's simply the number. And what's important about this graph is that you see that with the addition of each risk factor, the likelihood of child maltreatment of various kinds increases. But after you get past 3 risk factors, up to 4 risk factors, the likelihood of this negative outcome, child maltreatment, goes way up. Again, it doesn't matter what the risk factor is, it matters that there are a lot of them. So another way to think about this is in what we call the Swiss cheese model. This actually comes from engineering, but it shows that when you have a lot of different factors, and here we'll think about these as systems levels. If you have a risk factor in 1 or 2 levels, that might be okay, because there's some protective factor, some solid cheese, blocking a hazard. Here the holes are risk factors, the solid cheese are protective factors. When you have risk factors all the way through the system, then the hazard or likelihood of a negative outcome increases. Okay? So we're going to have holes in our cheese at every single level. We're going to have risk factors and protective factors at every single level. Problems occur when there are lots of holes all the way through. And what's the largest bundle of risk factors? Poverty. Poverty creates holes in our cheese all the way through, because there are risk factors in terms of education, in terms of problems of access to health care, nutrition, parental stress, dangerous environments, and so on. So if we care about human development, we have to care about poverty. Okay, that's all for now. See you soon.